So, a little bit about QA first, because that's a really big Friday floor filler. QA is the UK's expert quality body for tertiary education. We sometimes emphasise the fact that we're independent as well. So we have a variety of different contextualised approaches in the different parts of the UK, as you may be aware. And we have around about 300 members. And we're particularly proud of that because in the English sector, where quality arrangements are different, being in membership of QA is entirely voluntary. So we're very proud that we've managed to retain that number of members. The majority of our members are, as you might expect, universities or other higher education institutions. But of those 300 UK-based members, we have about 70 are college members because QA has had responsibility for looking after external quality in the college sectors in parts of the UK nations, in parts of the UK other than in Scotland up to now. And as you know, arrangements in Scotland are also changing. And we have really extensive international links. We also have a number of international members of QA as well, which is an area that we've been growing over the last little while. So that's a bit of scene setting about us. How about AI? Well, we've already established, and you've heard from a number of illustrious speakers about the fact that it's not new. We've coped with the advent of mobile technology, we've coped with the internet, the telephone, what else have we coped with? The calculator, all of these things that education has needed to adapt to. And actually quite recently, while clearing out my office in Glasgow, I found this, which is a really handy little booklet, which is called Are You Switched On? The Internet as a Resource for University Administrators. So we've coped with a number of seismic shifts in the sector and somehow managed to carry on. So within the university sectors across the UK, or within the higher education sector across the UK, the really rapid rise of AI, and I know Michael was speaking to you about that earlier, about the rapidity of its availability and how accessible it seemed to quite suddenly come. So it's not a new thing, and we've just heard from Bolton College, very pleased to say, one of our member institutions, that we just heard about the length or the extent of time that they've been engaging with AI tools, and in fact we all have for quite some time, maybe not to the extent of Bolton College with our students, but we've had predictive text, we've had a whole variety of different tools before. But this year, or last academic year rather, really did see the rapid rise of generative AI tools. They suddenly became increasingly available and accessible to students. And that, very understandably, prompted a lot of concern, particularly around academic integrity. How could we be sure that students were going to be awarded qualifications on the basis of their own effort, rather than having engaged in some undesirable way with generative AI tools? So big questions were around how do we manage assessments that were already set before it was appreciated that things like ChatGPT and so on were going to be quite so widely available. There was questions about and concerns around how we detect the use of generative AI. And initially we might have thought, well, of course we'll be able to detect generative AI. I mean, look at the image there, for goodness sake, it's really quite readily fallible. But actually, and I know Michael will have been talking to you about the rapidity and the increasing sophistication of these tools, actually we cannot be certain that we can detect them. And although there are a lot of commercial outfits, and very, I understand they've got to make money somehow, but they're selling tools to help you detect, or potentially help you detect, we know that the risk of them being wrong about students' use is too great. And we can't run the risk of accusing students or indeed learners of having used these tools in inappropriate manners without really being certain about that. But we were interested in the early stages about, can we detect their use? Should we be detecting the use? Should we just ban the use of generative AI altogether? That was a common question earlier on last year. I think we've come to the conclusion that we really need to embrace it. There's absolutely no point in trying to ban it. It would be like trying to ban the internet, or some of the other points I raised earlier. But nonetheless, those were some of the early questions. So a lot of the questions are circled around notions of academic integrity. And through QA, in the good old days when we were merely concerned about essay mills, QA was very active in producing guidance and support around academic integrity. Some of it focused on misconduct cases, so what is, because institutions have different ways of defining different types of misconduct, have very different penalties attached to them, so we created a lot of resource around that. The rapid shift to digital during the pandemic times prompted concerns about the design of assessment there and the security of it, so we have a range of materials to help with that. And we're increasingly very focused on the positive sides of it, so the student perspective, and promoting good academic practice rather than simply trying to root out less good practice. So we've got a range of that material. A really key publication for us is the Academic Integrity Charter. Now that sets out a range of principles of good academic practice for providers to use with your staff and to use with your students. And we invited our members and institutions beyond our membership to sign up to the Academic Integrity Charter as a public commitment to good academic practice. And at the moment we have over 200 signatories, and there is no financial reward attached to it, but you would be very welcome if you want to consider that charter and think about whether your provider would benefit from signing up as that kind of public commitment to it. Within Scotland and Wales, all of the higher education institutions have already signed up. They agreed collectively to do that. As I've indicated, in other parts of the UK, things are a little bit more disparate, but nonetheless, it's important to have that. If you're wondering where to get these resources or where to find them, if you go onto the QA home site, you'll see the line along the top. If you click on membership, then you can find out all kinds of things that we're up to in membership, lots of resources in a variety of areas, but around academic integrity, and that will also take you to information about generative AI. So one of the other things that we're very heavily involved in doing is funding and supporting collaborative enhancement projects. Right now we're funding over 45 projects across a whole range of topics, but 2 of them currently are specifically around areas of academic integrity. And this one in particular, it started off with a focus on general good practice in good academic practice, but very quickly, because of the rapid rise of ChatGPT and tools of its like, then it had a focus on generative AI as well. And one of the things that project was looking at was, why is it that students with certain characteristics tend to be overrepresented in cases of misconduct? So students whose first language is not English, widening access students, and so on. Why is it that they are particularly prone to be identified as having engaged in less than positive practice? And what is it we can do about that? How can we support students? So this particular project has produced a vast array of resources that can be used with staff and also with students directly. And again, these resources are publicly available. You don't have to be in QA membership to access them. You can go right onto our website and follow the links I showed you in the last slide through to our collaborative projects, and you can access them there. The other project we funded is looking at some of the other naughty issues in academic integrity, like proofreading. So when does asking your mum to proofread your essay become a reasonable thing to do? When does it become your mum's essay? And obviously, if I'm your mum, then you're in a lot of trouble on a number of fronts. So, but more particularly about generative AI, we produced a range of guidance on that. So early on in the calendar year, we produced a briefing paper and a range of factors that we wanted to flag for our members to consider. Our members there is a huge diversity amongst our members. So, from reasonably well-resourced, research-led universities to a number of colleges who, and I know standing here, I don't need to tell you about how tight finances are in the college sector, and I'm very well aware of all the absolutely fantastic, wonderful things you do, but there are a number of our member institutions who find it really challenging to be addressing these topics on their own, and that's where sector bodies like JISC, as very rightly have been flagged already for producing excellent advice around technical aspects of this, but it's an important role for us as well to help to support those institutions. So we're very aware that our members are all at very different stages in this. But we had 3 public events to offer opportunities to flag some of the key issues, and I'm very pleased to say we had absolutely fabulous speakers, including Michael. And I'm not only saying that because you're in the front row, but maybe a little bit. But Michael was absolutely excellent, and we were able to engage the number of international colleagues as well. Moving through the year, our more recent piece of advice, I'll say a couple of things about momentarily, was focused on assessment design and thinking about this academic year. And we were also focusing on positive uses of these AI tools, for example, how we can use them as a force for good, how students can use them in research-orientated projects. And you can actually access the recordings for these events. Again, they're publicly available too. So thinking about that assessment design piece, some of the things that we've been asking our member institutions to think about is creating space in the curriculum. Where it may be a feature of you in your own place, but certainly a number of higher education institutions are guilty of over-assessment. We do tend to over-assess our students. And students who are very busy, who are getting stressed, students who have a lot of outside calls on their time, and I know that accounts for a lot of students who are at colleges, who have a lot of other commitments elsewhere, as well as their studies. When students are short of time, they start to get stressed. That's when they're more likely to engage in things that you would prefer they didn't. That might be an old-fashioned business of getting a piece of work from someone else and turning it into their own, or it might be now in the new world turning to some of these AI tools. So let's try and help our students not be in the position where they might be tempted to engage in that kind of activity. Although I'm also aware that the students who do that are not the majority. I'm very well aware of that, but let's think about that. We're also interested in asking our institutions to think more about synoptic assessments, so thinking about programmatic assessment, rather than thinking about every unit of learning or every module, or think about creating a separate piece of assessment or assessment instrument for every individual learning outcome. Let's think about it holistically. Will that help? And then the final one, because there's nothing like quoting Aristotle on a Friday, think also, and something that colleges are extremely good at, is looking at authentic assessment. So assessment that's close to the kinds of things that your students will do once they've achieved their award and are moved out into whatever it is that they're doing next in their lives. I know colleges are extremely good at doing that area. Some universities are very good at it as well, but not universally. And so that is something that we want to really focus on. Assessment choice needs to be contextualised. It needs to be contextualised to the particular programme. So we're not recommending a blueprint or a particular approach as one size will very definitely not fit all. But our piece of guidance runs through a variety of commonly adopted assessment formats, and it highlights what the kinds of risks are in terms of the likelihood of students or the likelihood of those assessment types and formats being vulnerable or open to undesirable use of generative AI. And I want to just say a couple of things about hybrid submissions in particular, because we do think, I know a lot of assessments that don't involve written submissions, but quite a lot of them do, and particularly in the university sector still, there's a big proportion involve written work in some way. And we very strongly suspect that the future is going to be of a hybrid approach, whether students will run some questions through generative AI tools first and then adapt them, or whether they'll do it later, or whatever, however the tools will be adapted in the future. And we know already that a lot of our researchers make use of generative AI tools and helping them to do more things more quickly around literature reviews, around basic searches, around to give them a sort of core of work. So they're already submitting pieces that are hybrid, and it is frankly only a matter of time, if it's not already happening, that's what our students will be doing as well. And it's for us as educators to think about the extent to which that's acceptable and appropriate, and actually maybe quite a useful thing to be doing, or whether there are certain cases where you want to think about whether that constitutes responsible use or slightly less desirable use. So you will need to think about that individually. But what we're hoping to do through these pieces of advice and guidance is give you some prompts of things that it's helpful for you to have thought through, and then to be able to communicate to your students what your expectations are. One of the international speakers we had at our open events was Maha Bali, who is, some of you may be familiar with her work because she does a lot of speaking. She's published a lot, and across social media as well as more traditional forms. She's an associate professor of practice at the American University in Cairo. And one of the things that Maha Bali was emphasising, she talks a lot about the foundational skills in education and encouraging us to really think about them, think about the extent to which those are continuing in spite of other elements that might change. So what are the real foundational things that we're doing with our learners when they come to study with us? And she is advocating strongly that we need to add critical artificial intelligence literacy into that set of foundational skills, because we need to help support our students, and even almost before we do that, we need to help our staff to be critical, to be constructively critical of these artificial intelligence tools. Be aware of what they can do, be very aware of their limitations. And when I'm saying that, I don't just mean running something through and going, oh, it's made 3 errors in this mathematical calculation, but actually beyond that, being very aware of what the tools are, what your use of them means in the particular context. I think that's incredibly important. So thinking about the new year, some of the top sort of tips that we're suggesting is being very clear about policies. That was a big challenge for last academic session, was that these generative AI tools became widely available in advance of most institutions having policies around their use. And that made a real challenge and made it feel quite scrambly for colleagues on the ground dealing with students. So your policies need to talk about your expectations for students around the use of generative AI. What does appropriate use look like? What does that feel like in the different contexts? Think about misconduct and misuse. Do you want to define what that is? And will you have more of a principled approach that will be adapted depending on programs, depending on assessment type? I'm not telling you what it should look like, but I think it's a good idea to consider that. Also think about agility. How often will you need to revise those policies or review them based on the rapidity of development that I've been talking about already? And really think about the whole academic community. Be very clear, communicate, and keep talking to your students about this, and keep talking to them about what your expectations are for them, what your hopes and aspirations are about how they'll engage with this emerging technology, and really make sure that you're engaging and empowering students and your staff. And I can't emphasise enough the importance of providing that development, providing opportunities for staff to become familiar, because the more confident staff are, the more confident they'll be in managing students, and the better that is for all of us. So let's think about generative AI less as the kind of scary, oh my God, let's ban it, how horrific is this all going to be? We'll all be out of work shortly. Although, having a little bit less work might be quite nice. But let's see it as a catalyst for positive change. Let's seek the positives, be aware of the challenges, but think about, I do think that employers increasingly, if they don't already, will expect our learners when they've come through our colleges or universities, they will expect them to be aware and to have skills in using these tools, because they are ubiquitous. They're being used all over the place. We're using it in our workplace, and it's very, when we're employing people, we're interested in folk who've got skills in this area, and lots of other professions and vocations will be in the same position. It's a great opportunity for gains and efficiencies, of course. But there are also a number of key questions, and I've flagged some of them here. And what does responsible use look like? And what will the use of these tools mean for the relationship we have with our learners? And what is it that our learners will come to colleges and universities for? Will that change a bit? I'm an absolute passionate believer in education and the power of it, and I don't think for a second that people will lose their thirst for education. That hasn't happened with the advent of any of these other tools, and I don't think it'll happen with this, but I think there will be different things, and it's important for us to think about what is it that as colleges or universities, what is it that we give students that they won't get anywhere else, they won't get from a training company, and they won't get from a generative AI tool sitting in their bedrooms or staying at their employers or whatever else they're doing. But so I think it's useful for us to think about that so we can communicate that elsewhere. Thanks very much for your attention. I'll be really happy to answer questions.
We have time for a few questions. Who would like to kick us off? Graham.
That's really interesting. Some really good messages there. Just around the policy one, because obviously there's something about that kind of cycle of iterative between practice and policy. And public bodies, particularly yourself in that way, even though independent, are pressured to have a policy statement, but actually it's unenforceable because we haven't actually got practice to back it up. Also, if you say you're not allowed that, but actually we've no way of finding.
Yes.
And so I think there is something about how does policy and practice evolve in a cycle that's an ongoing iterative process, I guess, because much policies in the public domain, education domain, most of them are unenforceable in lots of ways. We state it and hope that people believe it to be true, but actually we know that we've got no practical way of making it true. And I think just in this AI one, some really interesting about policy, and I'm just interested to know from a QA perspective how you think that practice policy cycle will evolve for you.
Well, I think in many respects you've almost answered that, because it does need to be in that iterative cycle. I think the other thing is that we probably need to be very careful about not referring to things as policies if we know that we can enforce them, because that actually isn't then a policy at all. It's just a bit of an aspiration at best, or it's maybe a bit Pirates of the Caribbean, where we're saying, well, it's kind of less a code of practice and more a sort of set of guidelines. And I think we've tried to think about how we're labelling some of our advice, and actually labelling these things as advice or labelling them as sets of principles and so on, because, well, one, we can't enforce anyone to do anything. The nature of QA is that we are in the space of persuasion and influence, and also we recognise that our members are in very different places. So we're not in the business of one size fits all. But thinking about that from a provider perspective, I think that might be useful to think about really drawing in the community of your staff and students, setting down, thinking about, so only setting into policy things that you can actually, or that you do expect and that you can actually implement and deliver, but perhaps having a wider set of principles that you're trying to work around. It's thinking about the culture. I think that works very well in the wider sphere of the culture of institutions. That's what will deliver quality enhancement, for example, in the round, is having that culture of staff and students engaging together. And that's absolutely the case with generative AI, I think, as well, is about that culture, right? So you can identify what is it you're hoping to do, what is it you hope to achieve, and then outlining some of the ways in which you intend to achieve that together as part of a community. And then, but you also need to persuade your staff and your students to engage in that and encourage them to uphold those aspirations as well. I think that's the best we can hope for. We're not, it's not a police force, even if we thought that was a good idea.